Let me get straight to the point. We all suck at studying. And if this sounds like you need to watch this video. Let's say you go to your lecture or your class, you take your notes, you highlight, and you read your notes again. But after a few days, all that information has just completely left your brain. Now, it's not your fault. School doesn't teach us how to study. Instead, they just tell us to study. So in this video, I'm going to give you a full guide on how I studied in my first year of university, which essentially got me into med school. But before that, kia ora, vanakkam, and hello. My name is Vinu and I am a second year medical student at the University of Otago. Before we go into the chunk of this video, there are two really important things that I want you to take note of. And the first thing is I want you to understand the difference between studying and learning. A lot of students think studying and learning is the same, but they're actually not. Studying is the input and learning is the output. So what do I mean by that? Studying is essentially the process of actively reviewing and engaging with the material you are being taught, whether by taking notes, reading, highlighting, or even doing practice problems. So it's all that work you're putting in, therefore the input. Now for all the work that you're putting in, you need to get something out of it. And that's the learning process. So learning is how much of that material do you actually understand and retain so you can explain it later. So therefore, learning is the result of studying effectively, therefore it's the output. Think of it like this. Studying is like planting seeds and nurturing the soil. You're putting in effort by watering, adding fertilizer, and ensuring the plant has sunlight. Learning, on the other hand, is like harvesting the fruit. It's the result of all the care and effort you've invested, where you finally see the growth and can use or enjoy what you've gained. The second thing I want you to take note of is actually ask yourself this question. What is my goal when I'm studying? Because you need to study with a purpose, and for most students, their primary goal when it comes to studying is memorization. And there's nothing wrong with that because we want to remember what we're learning. But when memorization becomes our primary goal, all that ends up happening, we try to memorize as much facts and information as we can. And that's going to be really helpful when you encounter multi-choice questions. But let's say you encounter a mini essay or a short answer question where they want you to explain a process or maybe compare two different processes, then you're going to struggle a little bit. And that's why I believe when you're studying, your primary goal should be learning. And why is that? Well, it comes back to what I said before. Learning is how much of the material do you actually understand and retain. If you don't understand what you're learning about, then what's the point of just memorizing random facts? And when learning becomes our primary goal, memorization is going to happen automatically because the better you understand something, the better you're going to be able to store it in your memory. So those are the two things I want you to keep in mind. The difference between studying and learning and your mindset when it comes to studying. So with that out of the way, let's dive into my study method, which is split into 4 parts, and they're called understanding, connection, active recall, and spaced repetition. So first up, we'll look at the understanding part. The understanding section is split into 3 distinct phases. The first phase is called the basic understanding phase, which happens prior to the lecture. So before your lectures, you have access to your lecture slides. And what I like to do before most of my lectures is just preview those slides by skimming through them. Now, when I say skimming, I don't want you guys to just mindlessly scroll through your slides, look at a few diagrams and call it a day. I want you guys to skim with a goal, and that goal is to build a very basic framework of what that lecture is about. Think of this phase as your initial building blocks. You're just grabbing bits of information to get a rough idea of that lecture. Something that might help you build this basic framework is as you're skimming through those slides, you might encounter words you're not familiar with. And when that happens, highlight or note them down, and once you're finished skimming, just look them up on the web and write your own definition for them on those slides. And I don't want you guys to spend too much time on this phase. Anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes is good enough. And I'll tell you why previewing your lecture slides is really important on the next phase, which is the solid understanding phase. This is the phase where I actually go to the lecture or watch my lecture recording. So by the time I enter that lecture theater, I already have a rough understanding of what that lecture is going to be about. This is where the basic understanding phase comes in really useful. So some students, they just like to rock up to the lectures without looking at the slides prior to the lecture. And so what tends to happen is they get a bit confused when the lecturer is explaining because it's their first time seeing those slides. They will get confused with words they don't understand, the layout and the structure of the slides, and generally just the information on those slides. But you have an advantage here. Since you've already previewed those lecture slides, you have less time to be confused and more time to actually focus on the parts that you didn't understand the first time. Therefore, your goal in this phase is to adjust or strengthen the framework that you have previously built by filling in the gaps in your understanding. So, how do I do this? It's actually really simple. The way I do it is when the lecturer says something that is valuable for my understanding, I'll just annotate what they said onto the lecture slide itself. So think of this phase as putting the building blocks together to create a solid foundation. Now, for some lectures, I'll just stop here and then go on to the next part because I understand it pretty well. But for some lectures, the foundation isn't always well put together because I'm still unsure about certain parts. And that's when I go to the next phase, which I like to call the deeper understanding phase. This phase solely exists because there are times where after the lecture, or no matter how many times I rewatch a lecture, I still don't understand certain parts of a topic. And so what I end up doing is I do my own research by asking other students, searching on the web, or even looking at textbooks. And often what ends up happening is I tend to go a bit too deep into the topic, like the parts we don't really need to know. But that's perfectly fine if it helps you understand the topic better. Something I like to tell myself is never limit yourself to what you want to know based on what you need to know. So the goal of this phase is to just see any tiny gaps that we have in our foundation. So that is it for the understanding part. You started off with the building blocks, built a solid foundation, and then strengthened that foundation. So by the end of this part, you have achieved a good understanding of the topic, which now allows us to move on to the next part, which I like to call the connection part. In this part, my goal is to connect the foundation I built today to the ones I've built previously. For example, if today's lecture covered enzymes and it links to something that I've learned in metabolism, I'll link those topics together to see how they interact. Think of your knowledge as a puzzle. Each lecture is a piece, and this part is where you start connecting those pieces to see the bigger picture. Why is connecting these puzzle pieces important? When I started practicing mini essays and short answer questions, I noticed they often combine ideas from different modules or ask you to compare different processes. Connecting topics not only gives me a broader understanding, but also helps me organize information in a way that makes sense to me, and not just in a way that it was presented by the lecturer. The lecturer has given you the slides in a way that makes sense to them, but you don't have to stick to that order. For example, if understanding lecture 15 before lecture 2 makes sense to you, then that's perfectly fine. At the end of the day, the goal is to build your own unique web of knowledge. So how do I do this? I begin by identifying links between lectures. I look for recurring themes, similar processes, or overlapping topics. Then I use this note-taking app called Margin Note. It's a great tab because it lets me pull information directly from the slides, organize it in the way I like it, and then visually connect the topics. For example, if I learned about enzymes today, I can link that section to my earlier notes on metabolism, digestion, or any related topic. This flexibility to rearrange and connect information lets you learn at your own pace and makes tricky topics easy to understand because they build on what you already know. That said, you don't have to use margin notes to make those connections. There are plenty of other ways to do this. For example, you can draw your mind maps, use sticky notes to group ideas, or just rearrange your notes in a way that works for you. The key here is to find a method that feels natural and helps you see the bigger picture. Alright, so now we've built a strong foundation and connected our topics. The next part is called active recall, and honestly, this is where the magic happens. Up until now, all we've been focusing on is getting an understanding of the topic. And if that's where we stopped and then did nothing afterwards, all that knowledge is just going to disappear after a few days. And that's where active recall comes in. Active recall is all about training your brain to retrieve information without just passively rereading your notes. In simple terms, it's like giving your brain a workout. Instead of rereading, you're actively testing yourself to see how much you can remember. And here is why it's so effective. When you actively try to recall something, you're strengthening the neural pathways in your brain that store that information. The more you use those pathways, the stronger that connection will get, kind of like building muscle in the gym. This makes it way easier to remember things in the long run, especially during exams. Now, my approach to active recall is split into two different phases. The first phase is where we actually make the questions based off my annotated lecture slides. I create questions in two ways. The first way I do this is by using an app called Anki. Now Anki is a flashcard app where you can write your own question, write an answer to that question, and then test your understanding on that question. Although Anki is a great app, I specifically use Anki for something called image occlusion. Now, what is image occlusion? So let's say there's a diagram and there are certain parts of the diagram you want to memorize. So you can upload the diagram into Anki, you can cover the parts that you want to memorize, and then test yourself on that diagram. So it is great for topics that involve pathways or visual content like anatomy or biochemistry, but that's all I use Anki for. However, my preferred way of making questions is just writing my own questions on a doc or a OneNote page based off the lecture slides. And there are two reasons as to why I prefer this over just making questions on Anki. So the first reason is that whenever I used Anki, I had the tendency to just get the answer to a question with the press of a button. So how it works on Anki is you have a question, and let's say you completely forgot this question, you can just get the answer to that question by clicking a button. Now for me, personally, there wasn't a lot of thinking going on when I used Anki like that. But when I made my own questions, I actually didn't write any answers for them because all the answers that I needed were in my annotated lecture slides. So let's say I come across a question and I'll spend several minutes thinking about that question, trying to get an answer for it. And if I really did forget it, I'll go back to my lecture slides and look at the parts I need to and fill in the gaps. This forces me to actively think about the answer as I don't have the option to immediately reveal it. The second reason is that whenever I used Anki, it felt like I restricted myself to remembering that one answer I wrote for that one question. But when I use my own questions without pre-written answers, my answers evolve over time. This showed me that my understanding is improving and it gives me the freedom to refine my thought process as I go. So the goal of this phase is to not just create questions, but to deepen your understanding of the material as you make those questions. Making good questions is an active learning process itself. Now I'll tell you guys how I make my questions on a doc or a OneNote page. So when I'm making my questions, I like to have my lecture slides on one side and then I'll have a OneNote page on the other side. This allows me to easily go to the lecture slides and turn the content into questions. So I'll first start off with very basic questions like the what and the where. These are very straightforward questions that help me solidify the foundational knowledge of the lecture. For example, I might ask myself, what is the function of this enzyme, or where in the cell does this process happen? These questions are great for testing something we call factual recall. Once I've made my basic questions, I then move on to some deeper questions like the hows and the whys. These are the type of questions that really get me to think critically about the material. For example, I might ask myself, why does this process only occur in this pathway? Or I can ask myself, how does this mechanism regulate this process? These types of questions really help me understand the concepts beyond just memorizing them. The third type of questions I might sometimes include in my OneNote page is comparison questions. So I might ask myself, how is process A different from process B? Or even something like, what is the difference between these two pathways? This helps me make connections between different topics and get a clearer picture of how everything fits together. So by following this method of making questions, I'm not just making random questions. I'm actively engaging with the material and deepening my understanding as I go. Once you've created all your questions, it is now time to test yourself. That's right, there was no point in making those questions if you're never going to look at them again. This now brings us to that second phase of the active recall where we actually do those questions. The way I approach my questions depends on whether I'm using Anki or my own OneNote questions. Now, if I'm using Anki, it is very straightforward. Since I mainly use it for image occlusion, what I'll do is look at the diagrams and see which parts I recall. It's a very quick and efficient way to focus on the visual learning. But when I'm going through my OneNote questions, there are a few different study techniques that I use. The very first study technique, and the one that I mostly use, is something called the Feynman Technique. There's a good chance you've heard of the Feynman Technique. It is named after Richard Feynman, who is a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and he was very famous for breaking down complex ideas into simple terms. So the basic concept of this technique is that if you can explain something in simple language, then you really understand it. If you can't, then that just means you need to revisit the topic. The way I incorporate the Feynman technique when I'm answering my OneNote questions is I pretend that I'm explaining my answer to somebody else, whether that's a friend, a classmate, or even just an imaginary audience. I explain the concept out loud, step by step, as if I'm trying to make it as clear as possible for a beginner. While explaining the answer, try to avoid overly technical terms or jargon unless you fully understand them. Now, this is going to be really hard when you do it for the first time, but the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. So just try to break everything down into simple language. And if you get stuck, that's perfectly fine. Just go back and review the material and come back to that question. The reason why the Feynman technique is very popular and the reason why it works is that it forces you to process the information actively rather than passively. Speaking out loud also engages different parts of your brain, helping to reinforce your understanding. And honestly, it's just a great way to catch gaps in your knowledge. If you can't explain something, you really don't understand it. The second technique that I use when going through my OneNote questions is sometimes I'll just write my answer on an iPad or just any type of paper. This technique helps me visualize my thought process and is especially useful as I get closer to exams. Writing out my answers ensures I can translate what's in my head into clear, concise responses, just like how I would need to do in an actual exam. While I use both techniques, I lean more towards the Feynman technique because it's interactive and lets me hear my thought process. However, writing is also great for solidifying concepts and practicing how to structure answers for an exam. Now, whether I'm using the Feynman technique or just writing my answers down, there's something in common that I do for both of them, and that is color coding my responses for each of the questions. And the reason why I do this is it gives me a visual representation of where I stand. It helps me figure out which areas I've mastered and which ones I need to work on. So if I'm able to answer a question very confidently without looking at my notes and I can explain it clearly, then I'll mark it green. If I can answer a question but I feel a bit unsure or maybe I'm hesitating a little bit, then I'll mark it orange. But if I completely blank out on a question and I'm really struggling to answer it without my notes, then I'll mark it a red. And this system just keeps me honest with myself. It's really easy to think that you understand something unless you try to explain it or just write it down. And the other benefit of color coding your responses is that the next time you come to review these questions, you can see which parts you need to work on first. So you go to your red questions first, then your orange questions, and then your green questions. And that's because when you're studying, work on your weak points, but when you're in the actual exam, focus on your strong points. So that's how I do my OneNote questions. But there's one more way that I want to tell you how I incorporate active recall into my study method, and that is by doing questions from past papers. And honestly, this is a game changer, and you've probably already heard this, but do your past papers as early as possible. And the reason for that is when you start doing your past papers really early, you're going to get familiar with the structure of your exams. Things like the types of questions they ask, the level of detail that you need to go into for your answers, and even like the wording of the questions is going to become second nature. But more importantly, the practice questions are like a reality check. They show you which parts you're strong at and which parts you're weak at. And sometimes I think I really understand a topic, but a past question will get me to think about a topic in a completely different way, and I'll just realize, okay, well, I don't really understand this part. So what happens is I'll just go back to my lecture slides, or I'll go back to like my questions that I made and just review them and come back to that question. And that's a good thing, it gives you time to go back to fix those weaknesses before the real exam. I like to treat my past papers as mini mock exams. So whenever you're doing a past paper, try to do them under exam conditions. Now, the reason why I do this is because you can never fully recreate that exam experience. Like the way you feel, the excitement, the nervousness, and all the different emotions that you feel, you can never fully recreate that. So when I say exam conditions, just try to be as close to it as possible. Number one, do it in an environment where nobody's going to disturb you. And number two, time yourself. So once you've finished that exam paper, review your answers against a marking schedule, preferably, as it will let you know the level of detail that you need. But if you don't have the marking schedule, that's perfectly fine. Just compare your answer to your lecture slides. And that will tell you where you went wrong or the areas that you need to work on. Think of past paper questions as the ultimate test of how well you've built your foundation, made connections, and applied active recall. By the time you're consistently doing well in these questions, you can feel confident that you're ready for the final exam. A final tip I'll give you guys is that don't save your practice papers until a week or a few days before your exam. Start them early, keep track of your progress, and use them as a tool to fine-tune your understanding throughout the semester. The earlier you start, the more time you have to improve. So that is it for the active recall part. So if you've made it this far, you might be asking yourself, I have a good understanding, I've made good connections, and I've even tested myself. So what's next? To answer that, think about this. If you only reviewed your questions once or tested yourself once, is that going to be really helpful for you in the exam? The answer is probably no. And that is where we go into the next part, which is called spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is all about reviewing what you've learned at spaced intervals so you make it stick in your long-term memory. So why is spaced repetition so effective? It's because it's related to something called the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve is a concept that shows us how quickly we forget things if we don't review them. So look at this graph. On the x-axis we have the number of days, and on the y-axis we have the percentage of memory retention. When we learn something for the very first time, we start to forget it pretty fast. But each time you review that information, the curve flattens and it takes longer and longer for you to forget it. So over time, with enough reviews, you will barely forget it at all. Spaced repetition takes advantage of this by reviewing the material just as you're about to forget it. This strengthens your memory and ensures you can recall the information much more easily in the future. And here's the key. Over time, you want to increase the space between each review. Therefore, it's called spaced repetition. The way I do spaced repetition is through something called a retrospective timetable. A retrospective timetable is different to your normal fixed timetable. Instead of setting a time and a date for when to review something, you base it on how well you know the material. So if you're really struggling with a lecture, you'll review it sooner. If you know it pretty well, you can review it later, and gradually increase the gap between the reviews as your understanding improves. I'll show you an example of one of my retrospective timetables for one of my first year papers. So as you can see, I did my retrospective timetable on Google Sheets. So on the left side, I have my lectures, and at the bottom, I have the different modules for this paper, which was Hubs 192. So when I'm going to review something, first I'm going to look at which lecture needs the most work, and that's going to be either lecture 9 or lecture 11. So let's say today I review lecture 9. And so what I do first is I'm going to note down today's date, which is 27th of January 2025. Once I've done that, I'll now go and review the questions I made for it on the OneNote page. And of course, I'm going to color code each of my responses. And once I've gone through that entire lecture and gone through all those questions, I'll look at how I did overall, and then I'll give a color code for this lecture. It's either going to be green, orange, or red. So if I did really well, I remember most of the content, it's going to be a green. If I did okay, then I'll give it an orange. But if I did really, really bad, then I'll give it a red. And this is why I love the retrospective timetable, because it allows me to focus on the lectures that need the most work. So spaced repetition is your long-term buddy for learning. By reviewing just as you're about to forget and gradually increasing the gap between reviews, you're training your brain to retain information for longer periods. Paired with active recall and a retrospective timetable, you can make sure all your hard work actually pays off when it matters the most. So, that is it for my study method. We started off with the understanding part, then we made some connections, and then we did active recall, and then we did some spaced repetition. But there is one thing I want you guys to take away from this video, and that is, please learn to study in a way that works for you. And the reason why I'm saying this is that everybody has a unique way they study and a unique way they learn. And in my first year of university, I found it really hard to study in that early stage. So I literally spent a whole month researching different study techniques, watching countless YouTube videos, and even asking my seniors what worked for them. And after a while, I kind of figured out the techniques that were working for me and were giving me the results I wanted. Now, I haven't shared my study method with you to say that this is the best study method out there. I'm not saying it's going to guarantee you A+. I'm not saying you're going to be the top student in the university if you use this study method. I've just shared it with you because it's something that works for me. And if you're able to take away something small from this video and apply it to your own study method and it works, that's great. That makes me really happy. So please let me know in the comment section if it does. But if my study method doesn't work for you, that's perfectly fine. There's so many different study techniques out there. Try different ones and stick to the ones that are working for you. So that is it for this video, guys. If you really found this video helpful, please leave a like or let me know in the comment section, and I'll really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. I'll see you guys in my next video. Thank you.